We're talking about the kingdom of heaven, which is how to have the rulership or authority of God. And Jesus, in Matthew 23, specifically rebukes human authority and the system of the Pharisees and the priests as being people who, as Jesus said, they did not enter into the kingdom themselves, and in fact, they hindered others from entering into the kingdom. Now, let's think about what he was talking to and what those people were doing. Those were folks who were the priests and the Pharisees, and as Jesus said in that context, he said, the Pharisees sit in the seat of Moses. So according to the Old Covenant, they had a right to have authority over others. They were the delegated, designated, anointed, appointed, ordained authority who had the right to do the ministry in the temple and the right to have authority over the congregation of Israel, the congregation who brought in the tithes and offerings. And they operated in the house of God. They operated on the altar. They were the altar ministers who were... Now that sounds familiar to us because that structure of the Old Covenant was Jesus was rebuking and changing, I believe, when he was demonstrating his system of apostleship outside that system of human authority which was in the Old Covenant. But that system is what is the basis for the church service that we do repetitively as Christians. You see, the fact is the church service, and I'll say this over and over again if anyone will get it, is based on the sacrificial laws in the Old Testament. It's based on the stuff that Israel had to do to get their sin forgiven, which was build a big building, build an altar, put the tithes and offerings, which is the amount of blood or amount of animals and grain and crops that needed to be offered to God, which was to destroy them, so that they could get their sin forgiven. And it was done through the priesthood or the authority of the priest, the Levitical priesthood, and as well as the Pharisees, who were, as Jesus said, the rightful rulers. They sat in the seat of Moses. They were the official authority. They were the delegated authority. They had authority and power over the other aspect, most of the tribes of Israel within the concept, and they were the only ones who could do ministry. They were the ministers. They were the pastors of Israel. My goodness. Now, that's the typological system that we base our church service on. Jesus said specifically that the Pharisees and priests, who, as I say, they operated the house of God, they ministered on the altar, they collected and lived up the tithes and offerings. By doing those things, Jesus said, do what they say, but don't do what they do. Now, what did they do? Well, I just described what they did. They operated the house of God. They ministered on the altar. They collected and lived off the tithes and offerings. And it's very clear that those are things that the New Testament church was not supposed to do anymore. The Bible in the book of Hebrews says the Levitical priesthood is done away with. It says there's no more sin offerings. It's talking about not doing those things anymore, not following those sacrificial laws anymore, because we have a new high priest, and all of us are supposed to be priests. It's a different system. We're supposed to be working together, all in ministry and all serving God, all entering his kingdom. But by doing that old covenant system, he says that they were not entering into God's kingdom. What does that mean? That means they were not following God's direct will. They were following this old covenant. They were following their covenant correctly, I believe. But by Jesus is saying there's a new covenant coming, and there's a new way of entering God's kingdom, and there's a new way of receiving his rulership. He was bringing this new covenant, and he was specifically doing away with those aspects of the old covenant, the sacrificial aspects. I believe that's why he was so, against and rebuking the Pharisees and the priests and the scribes of Israel. I don't think they were specifically a bad generation, as people often place on them. He was saying, look, doing that sacrificial stuff anymore, because I'm going to be the new offering. Jesus called himself everything that was tithed and offered. He was blood and meat and wine and oil. He described himself as the offering and the high priest, and he does that offering in the true Holy of Holies, in the true temple of God. So there's no need for us to build a replica in the earth anymore. Israel in the Old Covenant, before Christ came, had to build that replica in the earth and replicate what he was going to do in what he does in fact and does do for us when we believe in him and accept his offering on the cross for sin. So he does that offering in heaven now, but in those days they had to physically do it. So by doing that system, they were not entering into God's kingdom. Well, because why? Because they were exercising over Israel, and they thought themselves to be in authority, and they had the right to be in authority through the seed of Moses, as Jesus declared. Okay, so the Old Covenant gave human authority and rulership within Israel. Again, that system came into the church ages ago, and people rarely ever study it or question it, but we keep on doing it over and over and over again, don't we? Now, the other aspect, which is very interesting too, is by doing that system, by being those priests and scribes and Pharisees, by following those specific sacrificial laws in the Old Covenant, they were not only not entering into the kingdom, not only, they weren't following God's authority, but they also hindered others from doing so. So what he's saying is, by accepting human authority, following a system where one person is an authority over others, the people who were under them were not going to be under God's authority also. They weren't going to enter into the kingdom either. So that system of one person exercising authority over others, specifically of the building and the minister and the altar and the whole, and the specific delegated anointed ministry, actually hinders people from entering into God's kingdom, into the kingdom of heaven. So they don't enter, and anyone who follows it doesn't enter. So my question is, why should that be the typological basis for so much of Christian function, where we always have to function by those rules of the Old Testament temple, where they had the court of praise and the gate of worship and the court of praise and so on, where you start out with praise and worship, your tithes and offerings, you have the altar, the building, and you have a delegated minister who has authority, who's the only one allowed to speak or to talk, and we have all these rules that have been put in place that are human rules of authority. They build things that we see, but as Jesus spent time telling us, we should be seeking the kingdom which we can't see. We should be seeking an invisible kingdom. We should be seeking the kingdom of building God's kingdom in the earth, which is bought through souls. Remember Jesus talked about the tithe that we owe him. It says the tithe we owe him is the souls of them who are witness that he liveth. That's the tithe that he would like to receive as our high priest. All of us ministering the gospel and all of us working together as equals is the way to enter God's kingdom. So there's many principles in the kingdom, and there are many more I haven't actually covered because it's an extensive subject, but I suggest you study it and look to it to yourself, and you'll find a lot of truths about how to operate in the kingdom. And it's very simple, really. It's very simple. Ultimately, it's simple what the new covenant is. Enter in as a child, be innocent, and follow God's will, and work equally with others, and put the gospel as the first and most important thing you do when you do work with others. So that's what I think the kingdom of heaven and the kingdom of God are all about, and how to enter in. And I think if you look at that, you'll see it in the light of understanding what Jesus was doing and what the church in the Bible were doing. I think you'll understand it better if you'll understand what the kingdom of heaven and the kingdom of God are all about.